how do you determine that the human rights violations in question are partly or completely the result of these sanctions?
That's a very interesting question. Quite often, it's not possible to identify that violation of human rights, of specific human rights, is coming completely or is only 100% because of sanctions. Because quite often the societies which appear to be under sanctions may have certain economic problems before. Quite often, generally speaking, I do not know any country where no violation of human rights takes place. So therefore, when we speak about sanctions and the negative impact of human rights, we need to understand that it's not only black and white. So only sanctions have caused only this damage. Usually we speak about the number of effects, impacts, or elements which affect specific situation in a country. Again, I will give a situation, as an example, the situation in Venezuela. I have just came from the country visit to Venezuela, and before sanctions have been imposed, there was a serious economic problem, which basically started also from the point when the oil price started to drop down. And there have already been serious economic problems at that point. At the same time, after sanctions have been imposed, you could easily observe how situation became worse extremely fast. For example, the country started to be unable to provide the necessary medicine or to buy the vaccines because the bank assets have been frozen of the country, or the country can't do the bank transfers. Or for example, the revenues in Venezuela of the oil sale dropped from 100 to 1% only. So 1% of everything they received before could be used for functioning of the country and doing the social projects. Therefore, we need to take into account that sanctions is one of the reasons and one of the elements which negatively affects human rights in the country. At the same time, it's absolutely clear, and all these statistics and graphics show that it affects human rights a lot. And as a result, we can't speak that we should leave sanctions because that's not the only reason. No, that's not the case. In order to protect human rights, everyone is supposed to observe the rule of law and protect human rights. That basically means that from the point of international law, if we see that unilateral sanctions are negatively affecting human rights, this activity shall be drawn back to the legal niveau and violation of human rights shall be prevented and stopped.
Could you please talk more about what negative impact of sanctions you documented in Syria, in Iran, in Venezuela?
Well, that's a very, I would say, complex question on that point. I can mention it at several aspects. So the first time I started to look at the specifics of the negative impact of sanction on these countries as well as other countries when I was preparing my report to the UN General Assembly about the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures in the course of the pandemic. And generally speaking, when we speak about the pandemic, it appeared that these countries are impeded from buying medicine and medical goods, of delivery of humanitarian aid, and as a result, the population of the targeted societies appeared to be much more vulnerable than other people, although naturally every person around the world is affected in the course of the pandemic. Therefore, usually when we speak about the special impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of the pandemic, naturally we speak about the violation of the right to life, right to food, right to health, especially affected the rights of vulnerable categories of population, for example, of women, of children, of people which are suffering from chronic diseases. If we look at the specific cases in the responses of states as well as responses of international non-governmental organizations, it's possible to find, including the figures what types of medicine couldn't be bought in this situation. The very recent one, for example, as concerns Iran, was the problem with impossibility to buy insulin for the population of Iran because of this US listing of the last Iranian banks, which hasn't been listed before, in November 2020. And the problem was so enormous that it was not possible to buy insulin in Iran even at the black market. So basically, this exactly measure has directly endangered the right to life. In a number of other cases, when we speak about the medicine, the evidences clearly demonstrate that despite of the official humanitarian exception clauses, which are usually included in the documents imposing sanctions in every sanctioning country, these humanitarian exceptions, licenses or clauses are not functioning well. So first of all, it's very complicated to get a license. Secondly, there is enormous overcompliance. Thirdly, it's quite often very expensive to get a license because, for example, for small NGOs, they do not have lawyers, they do not have lots of resources, they do not know where to go, how to apply, and how to get this license approved. As a result, these humanitarian exceptions clauses can be characterized today as pretty ineffective and inefficient. So the existing theory, they do not work in practice. And here I'm referring to the data provided not only by the targeted governments, but mostly by international non-governmental organizations, because even they, which used to work at the international area and have like branches all around the world, they refer that they have problems with donors, which are scared of overcompliance, banks, and sometimes their own bank accounts have been frozen. And humanitarian organizations were unable to do a money transfer or to have to pay much more. As an example, we used to pay like 0.2505% for the bank transfer. But for example, to transfer money to Venezuela, it can be 5 to 10% for the bank transfer. So much more than it usually happens. When we speak about the specific impact of unilateral sanctions to the countries you have mentioned, it's necessary to take into account that these countries are under enormous pressure of unilateral sanctions. So not only targeted sanctions, but also sectoral sanctions. Due to the sectoral sanctions, as I have already mentioned, government have much less money and they can't use this money for social programs. So it impedes the development of the country. When we speak, for example, about Syria, I sent a communication to the United States as concerned the Caesar Act and prevention of foreign companies to interact with the government of Syria in the process of reconstruction. So generally, it prevents the government as well as the society to start rebuilding the society after the conflict. And the country has already been affected a lot by the military conflict, and the lives of people have been affected a lot. Naturally, there are enormous problems in the sphere of work. Again, I also sent a communication to the United States as concerns listing, for example, captains, which were delivering gasoline from Iran to Venezuela, which suffers because of the shortage of fuel. All the captains which were doing their job as a captains delivering this gasoline have been listed for doing their job. And from the point of international law, this activity doesn't constitute any crime. And therefore, people are scared to do this part of work. When we speak about the sectoral sanctions imposed to these countries, we speak about the violation of economic and social rights because people are losing jobs, they lose their income, and naturally all the consequences which come from that point. Children go much less to schools, people pay much less attention to the education because they need to survive. The level of poverty is increasing. Women are affected a lot because they are usually the first one who are losing the jobs. Children are affected a lot because they usually leave schools in order to earn some money in one way or another. Quite a lot of people start to be involved in some sort of shadow economy because they need money for survival of themselves and their families as well. Because of the impossibility to do money transfers and to buy necessary goods, the right to health is affected a lot in this situation. And as soon as the right to health and right to food is affected, the right to life is affected as well. Again, because of the impact of these sanctions, the right of education is affected not only because people quit education in order to earn some money. There is impossibility to buy goods necessary for educational purposes, either because of the absence of money in the state, or because of the absence of money of people who are doing that, or sometimes because of the impossibility to import this educational stuff, including, let's say, pencils and notebooks, to the country. So children can't use it anymore. Another problem, for example, which affects the right to education is impeding access to educational online platforms, which are now used very actively in the course of pandemic, like Zoom or any other stuff. If you look at the service agreement of Zoom, it explicitly says that you need, before starting using it, you need to confirm that you are not the citizen and you are not placed in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and other countries under the sanctions of the United States. And I have been reported, for example, that lots of people have to find a way to use VPN to be able to use these educational platforms. I have also been reported, for example, about the impediments to use other platforms, for example, for doctors. Syrian NGOs were reporting about the impossibility for Syrian doctors to get access to PubMed, which is basically a platform for medical staff where they share experience and where they share information how to treat the pandemic. There were impediments to use telemedicine for an examination of patient and prescription of some sort of medical treatment. So generally speaking, when we speak about countries which are affected a lot, all categories of rights of all population are affected. And naturally, when we speak about the targeted individuals, that is specific sphere of sanctions, in this situation, it's necessary to admit that usually people who are listed and the reason for they are listed quite often may constitute no crime. And as a result, these people are listed either for something what constitutes a crime, and in this case, they shall be brought into responsibility under the criminal law. But it's also possible that the country which is listing these people have no jurisdiction to do that. From the other side, quite often, the reasons for listing do not constitute a crime as such. And these people are announced to be bad people because they are listed. They are publicly announced to be bad people. They face the impediments in using their rights, like their freedom of movement or their economic rights are affected, their assets are frozen. And they usually have all these negative consequences they face without any possibility to get access to court. Here we need to mention that there may be two different situations. For example, within the European Union, Article 275 provides for the possibility to appeal to the European Court of Justice for people who are listed, and the number of so-called sanctions cases is increasing now a lot. At the same time, for example, there is no possibility to appeal to court when sanctions are imposed, for example, by the United States or any other states beyond the European Union.